السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you guys for attending firstly, and I want to say a big thank you to ISO for hosting this talk, because I feel like this is but it's just an understated issue. I think it's an important story. And just to give you an idea of why, or the sort of thinking I had behind this event, I want to start off with a little bit of an anecdote. So, this wasn't the poster which was advertised to you guys, this was one of the two posters which we had to choose from. So it was between this and this. And the reason I chose this one, and the rest of the ISO committee chose this one, was because we thought it was nice, obviously, but I had my own reasoning. And I feel like, generally speaking, we become so desensitized to conflicts in Africa, and it's like we have this inability to sort of capture our attention, unlike conflicts, let's say, in Ukraine, for example. And it's because we're sort of used to it. I think a good quote which represents this is by Stalin, not the best person, but it's a pretty sick quote. He says, "The death of one man is a tragedy, and the death of millions is a statistic." So, in today's talk, what I want to do, hopefully, is change that perception a little bit. I think that the second picture is more resonant and a better reflection of Sudan and what the Sudanese people stand for. And it's not just another failed state, but rather, to me and to so many other Sudanese people, the story of what happened in Sudan is so much more than another tragic African conflict. But rather, it's a story of a revolution which was stolen from us by the very people who claimed to defend it. So in light of this quote and in light of this way of thinking, I'm going to take you through my own personal journey, which was the idea given to me by my friend about how I should present this talk. And I hope that by giving you this personal journey about me, my family, my friends, the story resonates a lot more and you guys can understand precisely what we're going through as Sudanese people. Before that though, when I say I speak as a representative of the Sudanese people, I just feel like it's good to clarify that I'm much more privileged. The fact that I study here in this university, I live in London, I'm from a very small minority of Sudanese people who are able to live outside of Sudan in the first place. So I just wanted to make that clear that I'm much more privileged, and what I've gone through is what everyone else has gone through, and if not, they've gone through worse. So without further ado, I'm going to start my talk now. So the Sudanese fight for freedom isn't a new one. It's been passed down from generation to generation, and the stories of martyrs are omnipresent in Sudanese society. Many streets, parks, and public communities are named after them, and the legacy of our martyrs forever incriminate those who killed them and forever honor those who died in our cause. And one day, inshallah, we make it back to Sudan. I hope to find the names of the martyrs who we lost more recently, who we haven't had the privilege to mourn properly, honored just as those before them were. So I'm going to start with a bit of historical context. To begin with, I'll try and keep it brief, but Sudan has a tradition of the October Revolution, which began with the first dictator of Sudan, Ibrahim Aboud, who was ousted following violent crackdowns on university-led protests. Sudan's October Revolution was the first time in African history that an African dictatorship was overthrown by popular revolution. The second dictator was Jafar al-Nimeri, whose divisive policies resulted in civil war, which ultimately led to the secession of South Sudan in 2011, which has become the world's and remains the world's youngest country to date. And his policies of oppression and alienation are ultimately largely what led to some of the problems which we experience today. And in 1985, he was overthrown by his defense minister, Suwar al-Dahab, who was the first army officer to fulfill his promise of handing over power to a civilian government, at that time led by Sadiq al-Mahdi, which remains Sudan's final democracy to date. So the key point I want you to take from that brief history is that Sudan has a tradition, or perhaps maybe an unfortunate tradition, of revolution, and revolution which is ultimately stolen from us by those who claim to defend it. So the next and most important coup, which has defined my life and the lives of my generation, was that of Omar al-Bashir, which took place on June 30th, 1989. This coup, once again another coup in Sudan, but this one was a bit unprecedented. For the first time, this was a coup which managed to stop the army from taking power and giving it back to civilians, unlike the previous dictators. In 1990, 28 army officers attempted to restore democracy to Sudan, but the chain of democratic restoration was ended by Bashir's government, who successfully foiled the coup. And this, according to one commentator, who was my friend's granddad and was a former high-ranking army officer, was, in his words, the end of the Sudanese army, which will become a lot clearer how significant and how prescient that quote is as I continue this talk. So keen not to repeat the mistakes of the past, Omar Bashir initiated the process of weakening the Sudanese army. He replaced high-ranking army officers, police officers, and civil servants with loyalists, colloquially referred to by Sudanese people as Kayzan. Now, the term Kayzan comes from Al-Hassan al-Turabi, who was, just to keep it short, very influential in Bashir's rise to power. And the quote was, "Ad-din bahar wa nahnu Kayzan binakhif minhu." Religion is an ocean, and we are the cups, or Kayzan, which scoop from it. So they saw themselves or portrayed themselves as the saviors of Islam, but as you'll see throughout their reign, they were far from it. They began by dismantling the arts in Sudan and suppressing divergent thought and political opinion. Even khutbahs in mosques were tailored towards the government, promoting pro-government propaganda, misleading the general population through questionable interpretations of Quran and Sunnah. And this was all used as a political tool to keep people indoctrinated. Detention without trial was very common. Political opponents were arrested arbitrarily, beaten, raped, and often taken to ghost houses, which earned their name as people disappeared behind their walls effectively with only the sounds of their screams escaping. In 1993, Sudan was labeled by the United States of America as a state sponsor of terrorism after hosting Osama bin Laden and various members of Al-Qaeda, which led to sanctions which set Sudan's economy on the course which was to define the next 25 years. In spite of all this, 80% of Sudan's GDP was devoted to military functions which served Bashir's regime rather than providing for the starving population. Alongside weakening the army, alongside weakening the army's capability to overthrow him, as previous dictators have been overthrown, Bashir formed a spider web of loyalists or security forces and placed himself and his government, or Kayzan, at the center of that web. So two key security forces for our purposes are the RSF and the NISS. So in the middle you've got the Sudanese Armed Forces, which is the army itself, officially the army, which in the past had overthrown the dictators. And this is the one which Bashir has generally weakened and replaced with loyalists at the top of the army. Then you've got the National Intelligence Service, known as Jihaz al-Amn in Arabic, which was traditionally responsible for cracking down on protesters, mainly in Khartoum, but also generally the government's intelligence arm, and they had their own armed forces as well. And you've also got the Rapid Security Forces, colloquially referred to as the Janjaweed, who are a very significant player. I want you to pay particular attention to the army and the RSF, or the Janjaweed, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, or Hemeti. So these militias are only officially unaffiliated with the army, and he used these militias to sort of do his dirty work and reward them with Sudan's abundant resources while the population is starved. For example, it's well known that the RSF has its own gold mine, which it's responsible for, and it uses to, for example, improve the security forces, to make international relations, etc. And the Janjaweed, which is the Arabic name for it, which is a colloquial name for it, it translates to devils on horseback, and it earned the name after quelling uprisings in Darfur, which led to the Darfur genocide in 2003. Under the command of Hemeti, the RSF, or at that time the Janjaweed, ethnically cleansed over 300,000 civilians in Darfur, stealing, raping, burning people alive in their homes. I want you to remember these tactics which I just mentioned as they become repeated in the future: stealing, raping, and burning their homes. So the economic situation in Sudan was generally tolerable up until that point for the majority of the population. That is until the secession of South Sudan, in which Sudan lost 80% of its oil reserves. At that point, losing all that money and that source of income, as well as the corruption of the government combined, led to an increasingly intolerable economic situation. In 2011 and 2013, protests began to spark but were violently and swiftly suppressed by Bashir's regime. However, tensions between the government and the people continued to brew as many people became more outspoken and civil disobedience in Sudan generally gained traction. Resistance began to snowball throughout that decade until in 2018 the prices of fuel and bread skyrocketed. Now, bread is a staple part of Sudanese food. Sudanese people will know this, but what most people, especially in this country, wouldn't know is that it's probably the only really affordable piece of food for a population which generally lives under the poverty line. So it's very important to bear that in mind. Bread prices basically means you're not going to starve if you can't afford it. So in December 2018, in the city of Al-Bara, protests broke out, but this time it was much different from those of the past. For one, the living situation had become unbearable. It wasn't a matter of suppressing to stop people going out to protest, because if you didn't die from protesting, you die from starvation, essentially. There was a famous chant which protesters would do, which was "Al-Talqa maqtaqtu, taqtu sukut al-nas," which is the bullet doesn't kill, but people's silence will. Another reason why the protests in 2018 were different is because they were led by the youth. They were entirely non-violent. They meet the security forces with the chants of Silmiya, Silmiya, Haramiya, peace, peace against the thieves. As the security forces were trying to draw people into violent protests in order to suppress them more easily and have justifications. But the youth stayed relentless and committed and refused to fold. Another thing which was different about these protests is that they were much more well organized. People would post on Facebook, brief people about where to go, which streets were safe, where to avoid the militias, and neighborhood committees would coordinate on safe protest routes and timings. A lot of the time at the protests, we set up barricades, like these, which were intended to stop the security forces from reaching us. So every time you walk past the road, you build a bunch of barricades and you keep going. People get creative with it. Sometimes they use rocks, sometimes they use lampposts, advertising boards, just to stop the security forces from coming through. It was also customary for people to enter their neighbours' houses during protests. People would open their doors to welcome people in, to stop them from being attacked by the security forces, to help them hide until the security forces had gone. But crackdowns were very frequent, and this was a very frequent sign. A bunch of armed security militiamen riding trucks without license plates who would take you away, and oftentimes you would be heard about for quite a long time. However, despite the growing success, there were a lot of martyrs, and I think to follow the theme which I mentioned about trying to make this conflict more relatable and understandable, and to sort of get rid of that sort of desensitization which we've become accustomed to in Africa, I feel like it's necessary to sort of mention some of these names. So I'm just going to mention some who struck me the hardest while I was in Sudan, but I need you to bear in mind that there are over 1,000, and that's only from the revolution itself. That's excluding the statistics which are coming from the war, which I'm going to get to later. The first of which I'd like to mention is Dr. Babikr Abdulhamid Salam, who was a doctor, and he was treating patients at one of the open houses at one of the protests in a neighborhood called Buri. Now, upon realizing that he was a doctor, the security forces shot him immediately, as this was a tactic they commonly use in order to deter people. They don't want professionals going out, so what they would essentially do is they target professionals. They know you're a professional helping out the protesters, and they target you intentionally. As the professionals, obviously, they wield much more political, economic significance in the general population. So this was a common target. Another person, another martyr who died was Mahjoub al-Taj, Allah yarhamu. He was a university student studying at Razi University, and he was beaten to death by the security forces in broad daylight as he defended two of his peers. And finally, Ustaz Ahmed Khair, who was a teacher, as the name suggests, and he was a very politically active person. He was abducted by the NISS for his political opinions and taken to one of the ghost houses and tortured to death. However, despite the suppression which was going on and rapidly increasing, the marches only grew, because it almost became inevitable that you lose someone close to you, be it a friend or family friend, etc. It's like you have a choice: you either stay silent and watch these people be killed, or risk your own life to defend them. So rather than killing the protests only grew. His mother's cries soaked the streets, and murals began popping up in neighborhoods. Protests started arising spontaneously. You could be on a casual day out and you see a protest and you just join the protest, and more people would join. And there was a sort of change in culture during this time in Sudan. I remember me and my friends going to Salat al-Jum'ah once. We decided to go to one of the mosques which were less pro-government and rather would actually tell us about our Islamic rights and wasn't afraid to challenge the corruption of the government in an Islamic manner. So we went to a khutbah by a sheikh called Sheikh Mahram Mahid, who was very outspoken, and he started telling us about the rights to defend yourself. He quoted this hadith by Rasulullah. A man came to the Messenger of Allah and said, "O Messenger of Allah, what do you think if a man wants to come and take my property?" He said, "Do not give him your property." He said, "What if he fights me?" Rasulullah said, "Fight him." He said, "What if he kills me?" Rasul said, "Then he will be a martyr." He said, "What if I kill him?" And Rasulullah said, "He will be in hell." So, what I'm trying to get across to you with this hadith is, firstly, this is something which none of us even knew at the time. It was very common for the security forces to break into people's homes, not my home specifically, but it's happened to lots of people who I've known. And I'm not saying they didn't retaliate, but I'm saying they didn't know Islamically they can retaliate, because you've never been told this in the khutbah. It's always pro-government, respect the government, it's always something which supports the government. It's never something which actually enlightens Muslims about their rights and their responsibilities in Islam. So, right before our eyes in 2019, we were witnessing a shift in culture in Sudan, a new era and a new generation. So the protests continued to gain traction in 2019. So they started in December, like I said, December 2018, continuing through for those 4 months of the year, until on April 6th, which was a significant day, as that was the day on which Jafar al-Nimeri, the previous dictator, was overthrown. One of the organizations who was responsible for organizing the protests ordered a march on the army headquarters. Now, the army headquarters is essentially a big road in the center of Khartoum. It really stands out because, as I mentioned earlier, 80% of the GDP in Sudan is invested on army structures and security structures. So it really stands out. It's much better built than a general, town like the city of Khartoum. It's a huge area of land, like I'm talking miles, and essentially what one of the organizations did, the Sudanese Professionals Organization, they ordered the protesters to attend or to march on the headquarters. Now, I mentioned earlier there's a distinction between the army and the government militias, such as the RSF. The army itself isn't loyal to the government. It's been significantly weakened so that it cannot overthrow the government, but it has neither been outspoken against it nor with it. It's just almost neutral. So the idea of that day was to try and force the army to take a definitive stand with the protesters against the government and get rid of the dictatorship. Now, recall at the beginning of the story, I said that the army was gradually weakened. So we weren't really sure if they could actually defend us properly. We weren't sure if they would defend us properly. But we had seen various instances of army soldiers passing through protests, throwing up the peace sign, which was traditional in the Sudanese revolution. So at 1 o'clock on April 6, 2019, we marched on the military headquarters. People, unarmed, merely our chants and our faith in Allah, which is carrying us, nothing more. And we reached a petrol station just outside of Qiyada, which is the army headquarters. And we saw an army soldier who told us to hurry up and catch the march. So that day was by far the biggest march to date. And when we got to the army headquarters, we just saw the army officers watching us from the watchtowers, which are on the other side. They were standing down. They had their weapons sort of withdrawn. They weren't looking to challenge the protesters. They literally just let everyone walk in. And people started chanting, today we won't leave until Bashir leaves. And Sudanese people, very stubborn, fulfilled their promise. Essentially, the march began to grow as word started to get out to the general community. And people from all demographics knew that the army had stood down, so more and more people started coming to Al-Qiyada. People from all demographics, people of older ages, children, everyone felt safe enough to come to the protest, which wasn't something which people generally felt before. And essentially, gradually, the whole of Khartoum started to arrive. Sorry about that. Yeah, go ahead. So this So that was a video from my friends who was with me that day in the crowd, and this is another video which I think really captures the amount of people who were there that day. It's lovely. This needs to be a slide before. Sorry about that. One second. This video was taken on April 6, 2019, and this was the first day of the sit-in, and the days after, the sit-in continued to grow exponentially, so that itself wasn't even one of the biggest days, but on that day alone, it was estimated that there were between 1 to 3 million people on Sharia Qiyada that day. And as the sit-in grew, so did the people's resistance. Start seeing advertising boards which literally promote the revolution. You've got food being cooked for the homeless and poor people, the majority of which Sudan's population is. You start getting pop-up medical clinics to treat those who can't afford medicines, and you get pop-up schools. As well as that, you start getting art, people becoming braver, willing to challenge the government. Suppression of the arts, or the dismantling of the arts, which had been conducted by Bashir's government during its reign, started to become undone in a matter of days. You start to see these beautiful pictures, all of which were drawn on the walls of the military headquarters itself. And even Champions League games being streamed at Qiyada just to show them that we really weren't leaving. So the National Intelligence Service, of course, wanted to suppress the protests. They wanted to get rid of this. However, the RSF, or the Janjaweed, up until that point had not been active in suppressing the protests, specifically in the 2019 protests. In fact, there had been rumours that Hemeti, the leader of the RSF, had essentially argued with Bashir about this matter, and they were no longer on speaking terms, and that Hemeti was siding with the people. Ultimately, it was a marriage of convenience. Everyone was aware of what Hemeti had done in Darfur before. However, it was ultimately a matter of, we need people on our side. We don't have another option. And on the 11th of April, 2019, al-Bashir was eventually overthrown through a joint coup by the army and the RSF. So the army being the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF being the militia, which was initially established to support the government, essentially turning on them. So nonetheless, the NISS attempts to disperse the sit-in, and up until this point, the army had not been active in defending protesters. That is until an army officer named Hamid decided to take a stand against the attempts of the NISS to disperse the sit-in. He rode out on the tank and essentially decided to defend the protesters against the NISS, and there was active shooting happening whilst the army was defending the people and the NISS was trying to attack them. And I think the video which I'm about to show you on the next slide is really testimony to sort of, firstly, the situation, that the fact that the NISS is willing to target any and all forms of civilians, children, women, people of old ages, doesn't matter to them. But also a reason I want to show you the video once more on the theme of trying to get you to sort of relate is that I think it's really a beautiful video and it sort of testifies to the strength and will of the Sudanese people.
اسألك حيسجل بعدين بحكي له القصة دي ربنا يحفظ إن شاء الله بالعافية.
So for those of you who don't speak Arabic, essentially the mother is telling the child that they're playing a game. The army and the NISS are playing a game, so don't worry. And then she instructs him to throw up the peace sign, which again, symbolic of the Sudanese revolution, our commitment to non-violence resistance. On Friday, the 12th of April 2019, Friday prayer was commissioned at Qiyada. Once more, testimony to the fact that we were not going anywhere. Abdel Fattah al-Burhan took power that day from Bashir's right-hand man. Bashir had been overthrown on the 11th, replaced by one of his right-hand men, and ultimately replaced by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Now, the Friday prayer that day was really, of course, a sight to behold, and just sort of a fun fact, the same Imam whose khutbah we'd gone to and started the protest from in the earlier days, Mahram Mahir, was the one giving the khutbah to these thousands of people at Al-Qiyada. So it was really sort of a full circle moment in that respect. So post-April 12th, the sitting continued and became the center of the Sudanese revolution. It gave us a glimpse of what a future Sudan run by the people could look like. And one of the most momentous moments was the train arriving from Adbara. Now, if you recall, Adbara was the city which started the December 2018 revolution. It was the first city to start protesting and set off this chain reaction which led to the protests reaching Khartoum and other cities in Sudan. And having seen the sit-in, they decided to get on the train. The majority, or a lot of the residents of Adbara decided to get on the train and just hop straight onto it and drive right into the center of Khartoum. So the arrival of the train from Adbara was really like a symbol, again, another full circle moment, but a symbol of the strength and unity which we held as Sudanese people. And it gave us just so much hope. I don't think there's a stronger symbol than that. I've honestly never seen those train tracks used once in my 10 years in Sudan. Just that day, somehow, a train's driving right through the middle of the city, carrying all those people. It's genuinely incredible. So, despite this, negotiations between civilian factions and now the military, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Hemeti, the leader of the RSF, started to stagnate, and tension started to rise. The RSF's presence in Al-Qiyada started to become more noticeable, and there was a worrying sight of army officers, so the ones who had been defending us from the LISS in the first place, started to become disarmed and removed from Al-Qiyada, and an increasing RSF presence in Al-Qiyada. On the 12th of May 2019, there was a shooting in Al-Qiyada, just outside Al-Qiyada, where I think about 10 to 15 people or 20 people were killed. The people who were shooting them were just in RSF uniforms, but the RSF denied any responsibility, saying or claiming that the ones who had carried out the shooting were factions of the former regime. However, any suspicion that it was not the RSF who conducted the May 12th massacre was dispelled on June 3rd, 2019, which was also the 29th night of Ramadan that year. So it was about 4:30 a.m. and people were preparing for Eid. People had been out for Fajr, people were praying Tahajjud, getting ready for Fajr, getting ready for the last fast of the month. My mum had been working with a charity who was responsible for trying to organize Eid al-Qiyada, Eid al-Fitr, and this was a big celebration. It was supposed to be another momentous moment in the sitting where Eid al-Fitr was celebrated at al-Qiyada. It was common for there to be iftars and for there to be, prayers together at al-Qiyada, but this was going to be the first Eid, obviously. However, at Fajr, about 4:30 a.m., the RSF decided to brutally ambush and open fire on those at the sit-in. Now, the people who were there that night weren't as many as in the videos which I showed you, but there were a lot of people, in the many thousands. And the RSF opened direct fire on those who were sleeping. Although the army did not participate directly, it merely stood and watched the RSF soldiers open fire on the civilians and did not defend them in front of their own headquarters. And the same tactics which the RSF had utilized in Darfur, such as burning people alive and raping people, were essentially unleashed in Khartoum. We got a small taste of what they had experienced in 2003 in Darfur. At least 40 bodies were thrown into the river now, with the dead bodies being tied to bricks so that they would sink to the bottom and essentially just sort of evaporate in the water. I don't know the scientific term, but you understand. And nearby hospitals were raided so that even those who were injured by the shootings were unable to escape. Now, there are estimates on that day that there were between 130 and 250 people being killed. However, those are only estimates, and there are also many people who are missing and not found since that day. I read this quote, which I think is very symbolic of the mindset of the Sudanese people on the outside of the hospital on June 3rd. If I die, tell them what killed me was my love for the homeland and not the bullets. Tell them that I sold my soul to buy a homeland for them, and tell them that I want retribution. Following that day, a term which we became all too familiar with started to become coined, Eid Shaheed. Instead of Eid Said, instead of Happy Eid, it was Eid of the Martyrs. And immediately following the sit-in being dispersed, there was an internet blackout in which the Sudanese government attempted to hide its oppression and hide the massacre from reaching the international community. Nevertheless, just as we always did, we continued to defy the odds. And before I mention that story, I need to mention another martyr, who was Muhammad Hashim Matar, who was killed at the sit-in on June 3rd. Now, Muhammad Matar had a profile picture on Instagram and Facebook of his favourite shade of blue. And what his friends did to honour him was essentially make his profile picture their profile picture. It was merely a shade of blue, similar to the one which you can see in this picture. And it started off with his friends making it their profile pictures, and then their friends of their friends making it their profile pictures, and so it reached the Sudanese diaspora outside of Sudan from the few people who did have internet, and ultimately became a global trend. The whole world, including celebrities and influencers, all the way from Rihanna to Amjad Bey, had the blue profile picture, and Sudan broke the internet without internet. All this led up to June 30th. Now, I want these pictures seen between June 3rd and June 30th. The sit-in has been dispersed. The one big symbol of our revolution is no longer there. Nevertheless, in the face of increasing oppression, our resistance only grew stronger. People started promoting the June 30th march through night marches, as well as pamphlets, and broadcasting it from microphones in mosques, as well as through word of mouth. And despite having no internet, we found ourselves more connected than we'd ever been before. Now, June 30th once more is another significant date, as the more eagle-eyed of you would remember. That was the day which Bashir conducted his own coup. And on June 30th, essentially every street in Sudan became a qiyada. Rather than every person going to one street, everyone went to their local sort of neighborhood and organized their own millions march. So rather than having 5 to 10 million people in one area, you have 2 million here, 2 million there, etc. And the June 30th protests were the biggest ever. Up until that date, there had been protests estimated just below the tens of millions. And June 30th was even bigger, so I just want you to sort of appreciate from the pictures earlier that these were even bigger. And they were all around Khartoum as well as other cities in Sudan. And I really like this next video which I'm about to show you, as I think it's really significant. It shows the defiance of the Sudanese people. It also shows their fearlessness. If you see the trucks which are driving through the centre, these are the same trucks which dispersed the sit-in, and just 3 weeks later, you have a video like this again. Again, I want to share a quote with you following the dispersal of the sit-in at Qiyada. Whoever believes in the sit-in, then the sit-in has been broken up. And whoever believes in the revolution, then the revolution is alive and does not die. Following the significant protests on the 30th of June 2019, the military relented, appreciating that the Sudanese people truly weren't going to give up, and entered a power-sharing agreement with the civilians who they had initially been negotiating with. During those 2 years, between 2019 and 2021, was relatively uneventful. Abdullah Hamdok was appointed as a civilian prime minister for the first time in 30 years, and a series of political and economic reforms took place. Protests became generally safer and more feasible, and there was a crackdown on the properties of the former regime and themselves being arrested. However, it was a relatively uneventful 2 years in the grand scheme of things. And the transitional government, which was at that time headed by the military, was agreed to be handed over to civilians within 2 years. However, on October 25th, 2021, approximately 1 week before the anticipated transition to civilian rule, the all too familiar military music starts playing again, and we hear the sound on the radio, Bayan Ham Ba'da Qalil, important announcement soon. We figure that there's a joint coup staged by the RSF and the army together by their various leaders. You have Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is the president and leader of the army, and on the other side you've got Hemeti, who is the leader of the RSF. Now, if the intentions of the military had not been made clear from the Darfur massacre, nor the shooting of protesters, nor the massacre on June 3rd, the coup had made their intentions clear for everyone to see. And protesters were cracked down on in a manner which was reminiscent of what we had seen under Bashir's regime. The coup resulted in a revised power-sharing agreement, but this power-sharing agreement gave the military more power and left one very important issue undecided. How was the RSF, which is a separate militia, to be incorporated into the army? And rather than agreeing this point, the politicians and the international community, which was responsible for negotiating the agreement, merely kicked the can down the road. And that's ultimately where our problems lie today. So in the revised transitional agreement, Hemeti and Burhan had disagreed on how long it should take for the RSF to be incorporated into the army. Burhan advocating that the Sudanese armed forces should rule within the next 2 years, whilst Hemeti wanted the merger to take place over 10 years. Ultimately, that led to a war on April 15th, 2023, between two unwanted military dictators who were fighting to steal our revolution. Now, it's hard for me to sort of speak about the war because it's like, how do I get the message across? We've all heard about wars, we've all heard harrowing statistics, but it's difficult. I was genuinely thinking a lot about how I should deliver this to people who haven't lived in Sudan, because I appreciate when someone else tells me about the war, I can never truly feel it. People with serious tell about our war, we think that's tragic, but we never really truly understand. So I got this tip from a friend, and I'm going to go with it. Essentially what she told me is that you should just tell your own story, tell it from your perspective. Although I was here, unlike in the revolution, I can still tell you the perspective of me being here and the experience of my family who were over there, as well as my friends who were over there. So that's what I'm going to do. So on April 15th, 2023, I woke up to hundreds of WhatsApp notifications. Now usually I'm sort of aware, I've become accustomed to, like, if I see that many notifications, something bad has happened in Sudan, especially as we knew that the tensions between the army and the RSF had been rising in recent days. And I found a message from my friend which said Katamat, which is sort of Sudanese slang for it's essentially popped off. And my friends were in Sudan, who were either living there or there for Easter break. They started describing the scene of seeing fighting on TV, seeing clouds of smoke and looking out the window and seeing the exact same sight. My friends and family were waking up to the sounds of rockets and heavy artillery being fired right outside their windows and sending us audios on WhatsApp from under their beds. You start getting messages in WhatsApp group chats, which have been inactive for years, of high school friends checking up on each other. People sending pictures of their houses being obliterated or significantly destroyed. And you see video footage of weapons which you would never even imagine existed in a poverty-stricken country like Sudan. Military technology which is beyond the capabilities which you presume that a poor country like Sudan could have. It shows you what they've been reserving for themselves and what they've been depriving from the people. Then, as the war prolongs, takes a week, you start worrying about your family. The internet didn't cut this time, so I managed to speak to my family at least 3 times per day, reminding them to stay away from windows. And you could hear the fighting outside, but nothing really happening inside. Until one day a bullet from a helicopter shattered the big window at the front of our house, and things start getting a bit too close for comfort. Now, some of my friends at this point, as well as extended family, decided to migrate either internally within Sudan or towards the Egyptian border. And you start hearing that if you go out on the street, it's highly likely that you're going to get shot. You start worrying about your family's grocery supplies, these small things which you don't even think about in your daily life, but you start worrying about how long their supply can last them and what happens if their water runs out or if the power cuts. You then hear that RSF soldiers are breaking into people's houses, stealing their gold and their cars. You then hear that the RSF are stealing people's homes, so not just the things within it, but the homes themselves, forcing people to leave generational houses at gunpoint, often using sexual violence beforehand. And about a week later, we hear that my friend's aunt, Allah Hama, who's a few streets down from us, has passed away as a result of one of the Sudanese armed forces' targeted strikes of the RSF, one of the targeted airstrikes. And she passed away. She was just living a few streets down from us. And at this point, my family decided it's probably time to evacuate and decided to travel to the Egyptian border. And at this time, many people started to make similar decisions, seeing where this is headed. During this week, I lost complete contact with my family, and they were making this trip, which, as I mentioned, was very dangerous. You couldn't even go out on the streets during those days. But alhamdulillah, I was generally hearing indirect updates from people who knew my family along the way. During the next week, the war continued to intensify and get worse. This is Tawfeeg. He's the father of our friends Sarah and Rahma, and he essentially disappears after about 2 weeks into the war. And there's a massive social media campaign to try and identify where he might be, but we all start fearing the worst, we all start presuming the worst, naturally. We also have Bushra, Allah yarhamu, who is a close family friend and genuinely one of the most amazing people you can ever imagine. He is a role model for all Sudanese doctors, and he spent his career 6 months of the year making his money in the United States, and then the remaining 6 months coming and treating people for free in Sudan, as well as teaching at the University of Khartoum. And he was a true inspiration, one of the brightest characters I've ever known in my life. And he inspired not only his students, but a whole generation of Sudanese doctors. And he embodies the spirit of the revolution, a man who was qualified to work anywhere in the world but chose to use his expertise to better his homeland. He stayed behind as his family evacuated, the rest of his family, like his kids and his wife, evacuated, in order to care for his elderly parents who did not want to leave their generational home, which is a common problem you experience in Sudan. People having lived there for 60 years refusing to leave. And on the 25th of April 2023, he was murdered in front of his home during the lawlessness which now defines the streets of Khartoum. So during this time in which Tawfeeg has gone missing and Bushra has been killed, my family is still on their trip to the border, and I'm wondering if they've heard the news about Bushra. He was very close to them, and how they were feeling and in what manner they received the news. Was it by coincidence? Was it by someone informing them, etc.? At this point, I haven't spoken to my family in about 6 days, and I start hearing about the situation at the Egyptian border, which is where they're headed. And there are hundreds of buses and people of all socio-economic backgrounds sleeping on the streets, waiting to cross the border. There are no bathrooms, food, or water to drink, and the heat is absolutely unbearable. The wait at the border can last days, and it's utter chaos. However, it is safer than Khartoum is at this point. However, just to give you sort of an idea of how difficult the trip is, 2 of my friends lost their grandparents during or as a result of that trip, as well as many others who I'm not aware of. I tell my friends in passing, I haven't heard from my family in about a week, and I sort of just mention it in passing because I know everyone's sort of going through the same situation. But then the next day, I get a voice message from one of my best friends, Khalid, who was also in Khartoum at the time for Easter break, and he'd also gone with his family to the border around the same time my family had gone. And a few days, about a week after not hearing from my family, I got a voice message from him, which I'd like to play with you, for you guys.
يا توفيق السلام عليكم. احنا في المعبر حق أرجين، الحمد لله. موضوع صعب لكن ماشيين كويس. وعندي لقيت اهلك وامك قدرتهم لكنهم كويسين.
توفيق ازيك؟ كيفك؟ تمام؟ ان شاء الله بخير. معلش انقطعت منا كده، طبعا قطع نت وتليفون وكل منا اول امبارح. احنا كويسين الحمد لله، وصلنا المعبر وامورنا كويسه، بس في تاخير. اوكي، معنا اسمها وناس عم عصام وناس خالد منار وهسه لقيت ناس خالد مجاهد، كل الامور تمام. بس موضوعنا طويل شديد، يعني لانه في ناس كتار شديد، فاحتمال نصل بكره بعد بكره ما معروف. على كده اكلم الاء اطمن وكلم ناس نهاد برضه في الجروب، فسلم عليهم كلهم. يلا تمام. انا ما عندي نت، كلنا ما عندنا نت، فمرات التليفون عزل يخش معك. لو حاولت مره حاول شيل من نهاد. يلا مع السلامه.
So just to give you an idea of why I played that and sort of what they were going through, this was minutes after my mom had just found out that Bushra had died. So it's sort of like, it shows, you know, when someone is in a war zone and they tell you, you know, everything's alright. You see how my mom was speaking, you know, she sounds like she's just chilling, but that's how it is for everyone. You hear these updates from your family, but you never truly know what's going on. Another reason why I wanted to show you this voice note is to show you that everyone I knew was there. My teachers from high school, my family, my friends. It wasn't a coincidence they met there. They met there because everyone's there. It's just a small place of land, people of all socio-economic backgrounds, literally all in the same awful situation. So it's just to show you that there's real people going through this. And having described that to you and played that for you. Now, I'd like to read some of the statistics about the Sudanese war and hopefully give you a better idea that everyone is experiencing this situation or much worse. So as of now, 6 months into the war, 1 out of 10 people have fled their homes seeking refuge, internally or externally. 3.8 million have been displaced. 1,200 children have died as a result of the war, indirectly or directly. 6.3 million are on the verge of famine. 80% or more of hospitals are shut or irreparably damaged by the war. 25 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. And something else which I sort of didn't really want to write as a statistic is that the embassies, the passports to leave Sudan, the fees have been increased significantly by those seeking to exploit those who are fleeing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of the Sudanese population lives under the poverty line, meaning they live on under $1 a day. And passports being charged are about $200 to $325 for adults and about half of that for children. So, just to give you an idea of how significant that sort of money is. And essentially, the cowardly embassies and international organizations were the first to evacuate Sudan. The minute the war broke, it sort of reflects how they think about Africans. They left the day the war broke. They closed the embassies, which had people's passports. Imagine you submit your passport to renew it, to travel, and the embassy, which is responsible for your passport, decides to leave without valuing any form of leaving the country. This is a situation which many Sudanese people find themselves in. Hundreds are still missing as well. And I recall Tawfeeg, who I mentioned earlier, alhamdulillah, 2 weeks later he was found and released. It turned out that he'd been in captivity, held by the RSF, and he'd been fed for those 2 weeks mildly raw rice from a bowl, as well as him and many other men who were there. And he and hundreds of others had been captured by the RSF, and they were utilized as hostages and human shields against army raids. And the vast majority, like I mentioned, Tawfeeg had a massive campaign going for him, but the vast majority of the people who were there with him, still there. They don't have the same amount of people looking for them. So, I feel like an important thing to factor is like some people deny the joint roles of the army and the RSF in previous incidences, such as the Unveiled massacre, such as the killing of the protesters. But I feel like it's important to look at the facts. There's no good side in this war, but at the end of the day, we're in a marriage of convenience once more. This time we have to side with the army because we know what the RSF is capable of. At an institutional level, we've seen that the army does have people who will defend us when we need to, such as during the protest sites. But we also know that the leaders of the army, such as Abdel Fattah, do not have our interests in mind. And for those who question the joint role of the army and the RSF in previous situations in Sudan, I just wanted to remind you of some facts. So, the removal of the Sudanese armed forces from Al-Qiyada prior to the Unveiled massacre could not be possible without the consent of the higher-ranked army officers. The failure of the Sudanese armed forces to protect civilians in front of their own army headquarters, and the cutting of the internet, which I'd like to point out has not happened once during the war. The internet only seems to cut when the government is suppressing the civilians, but when they are fighting each other, it never seems to happen. And I'd like to conclude with some quotes from Rima Ali, who wrote in the Harvard Crimson. She's a Sudanese student. She made this speech when she was graduating. So I'll start with one quote which says, what my peers do not realize is that to me, this is everything. The home and the livelihood of my family, the streets I spent my childhood wandering, bombed and burned before my eyes. And to give you an example of this is Khartoum International Airport. Everyone who's been to Khartoum, this is like really iconic place. It's not a good airport, it's ranked one of the worst in the world, but to us especially, it's ours, So this is a picture I took with my mum, January 2023. It's the last time I was in Sudan, and decided to take a picture in front of her with the airport, this Polaroid camera I had. And the other day I saw this picture of the airport. It's just to give you an idea of what Ian is talking about. These are the sites we're really used to growing up with, and this is what they've become now. Another thing which Ian said is, this is now littered the street I walked a few months ago in a city where it is now a privilege to escape from and become a refugee. And how can the world possibly see humanity now when our African bodies were written off as disposable centuries ago? So, in conclusion, the story of Sudan is a tragic one. It's characterized by loss and decision of those who do not deserve to make such decisions. Those who tarnish the name of Islam for political purposes, who were not shy to use Islam to support their regime, but also not shy to kill unarmed civilians during days of Ramadan. Yet, it's a tragic story whose ending remains unknown. It is a story of resistance, resilience, and somehow continuing to bounce back in the face of insurmountable obstacles and adversities. And now more than ever, we face the defining chapter in our story. It is now more than ever we need the support of our fellow Muslims, financially, spiritually, and practically. We can continue to pray for our brothers and sisters, but recall the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, tie the camel and then rely on Allah. The true meaning of tawakkul is doing whatever we can do to support people and then relying or leaving the rest to Allah. So I hope that this talk today has changed the narrative in your minds, and I hope that I've shown you that the war is not really another African conflict or just another failed state, but rather a revolution that was stolen from us. And it's a story which has characters whose soul encapsulates the best of humanity and a dream which we will carry forward with unrelenting endeavour. Thank you.
Tawfeeg for presenting something so meaningful and something so insightful. I guess we'll start the Q&A now. So we'll try to finish for 6:30 inshallah. So anyone have the first question?
Okay, so Jazakallah khair, Tawfeeg. I think it's very, very important to have this kind of perspective from somebody who's actually Sudanese and has family in Sudan and is worrying about this constantly. And all that I've read has been from Western media mostly, maybe Al Jazeera too, but generally like BBC, CNN, that kind of stuff. So my one question was about Hemeti and the RSF, because what I've read is that, for example, in February he was saying stuff about how he regretted doing the coup in 2021 and how he wanted to hand over power to civilians, and you're saying that the RSF can't be trusted. So I was just wondering about, like, what do you think about that then? Do you think that he, when he says that he regrets doing the coup in 2021 or that he wants to actually hand over power to civilians, what does that mean? And my second question is about, for example, can you just sort of like explain why the RSF is so powerful? Because I mean, you can also see in Russia, the Wagner group, a similar, like, not similar, but like a militia that tried to sort of challenge government authority, that failed very easily. And so how is the RSF different in the sense that it's been able to actually wage this war for the past 6 months or so?
Okay, well that's a very good question.
What does it tell?
So he asked, what does the why does Hemeti say that he was regretful for the coup? Personally, I don't really listen to what Hemeti says, because at the end of the day, I feel like what he says always suits him. I haven't heard this quote specifically, but at the end of the day, I feel like the only regret he can have is that it didn't work. He wanted to portray himself as the savior of the revolution. He thought that he had the people on his side because of the momentum he gained as a result of, you know, overthrowing Bashir, etc. So I think he sort of, maybe in his own head, he overestimated at the time of the coup how popular he was and how feasible it was. So if he regretted it, I presume it was from a practical side such as that. The second question was, how is the RSF different and how they're able to wage a war? I think people often underestimate how rich Sudan is, like in terms of its resources, like natural resources. Sunnis people always bang on about this, like if we made use of our resources, we could be one of the best countries in the world, etc. So when you're getting given gold mines by the dictator as rewards for your loyalty, naturally, like that's going to give you money, which that's a nation's wealth right there in the hands of a militia of what, a couple 100,000, maybe 100,000. So yeah, like it's very understandable, as well as international backing, of course, from people such as the Wagner Group. So yeah, I think.
Another question? Anyone have any other questions? I've got a question. What do you think is what does the near future for Sudan look like? And like, what kind of obstacles? What's the biggest obstacles that you think that biggest obstacles?
Sort of, in a sort of practical sense, people who did have this sort of endeavour are going to look at Sudan and be like, yeah, why would I invest my money and my safety and risk my family's well-being by going back? So it's like sort of, how do we get them back after the conflict? I think that's the biggest issue which I worry about.
Anyone else?
Jazakallah khair, Tawfeeg, for the talk. Thank you for sharing your experiences. You mentioned the change of culture when you spoke about how leaders would open their doors for others to come inside and hide from the army or whoever's attacking them. I was wondering how that change of culture looked before and after that moment. So what was it like before that moment of attack and after?
I think in previous revolutions, such as, or attempted revolutions, such as in 2011 and 2013, there was sort of this culture of like looking down on people who protest. It's like, you know, firstly as a result of the indoctrination which was occurring through media, through you know, pro-government speeches by imams, for example, influential people like that. So I think the biggest change was people saying, you know what, actually no, like, we're actually going to stand with this, we're actually going to support this, we're going to, even if we're not going to go out and don't want to kind of, you know, run away from the security and be put in that position, we're going to facilitate that for people who are doing it already. So I think that was the biggest shift in culture. But it didn't change overnight, it took a long time. Even during those 6 months, there was a big transition. Like, I remember when we were going to Riyadh on April 6th, the guy in the like sort of Uber, Terhal, he was driving us to Riyadh, gave us the biggest side eye when he saw us talking about the protest. Like, it was obvious that he was, you know, angry that we were going to that. So it's not like everyone changed overnight. Some people still have that mentality, which is why war is even possible. So yeah.
What is that mentality referring to? Pro-government mentality?
Essentially, yeah, pro-government or sort of submissive, in the sense that, like, yeah, okay, we're not necessarily pro-government, the situation is difficult, we can't afford food, we can't live, they're terrorizing us, but like, what can you do at the end of the day? That's usually easier for people who have more stable economic situations than those who have less.
You mentioned the RSF gets their arms from Wagner's group.
From Wagner Group?
Yeah, but now Putin's cracked down on the group since the coup, the attempt in Russia as well. So has that kind of weakened the RSF in Sudan, and perhaps there's a resolution down the line?
That's a really great question, and I was actually watching a video about this relatively recently. It wasn't specifically on this topic, but it relates to it. It was a video of drone footage of RSF like cars and, you know, RSF soldiers being struck by drones which weren't operated by the Sudanese army. And I think it was CNN who posted it, saying that it was being controlled by Ukraine, essentially. And what Ukraine are worried about is essentially that Russia is essentially cracking down on the Wagner group. And while cracking down on the Wagner group, they're not just going to let the Wagner groups, you know, all their properties and all their, you know, potentially beneficial things to Russia just go to the wind. They're going to try and take advantage of that. They're going to, just like the Wagner group made the RSF there, or Russia would want to do the same. They essentially want the RSF to do their dirty work. So it's sort of like the RSF and the Wagner group, whilst at tension with each other, I think they're more politically aligned than people will give credit for, especially in situations like this which don't directly affect Russia. So it's a great question, and I think that the Wagner group being sort of having this situation in Russia definitely plays in our advantage, in the sense that, like, you know, the RSF doesn't have the same support as it did previously, but I think there's always a potential for Russia to sort of come in the picture and just do the Wagner group's work as well.
There was a sister that had a question.
Shukran Tawfeeg for your talk, it was very insightful. My question is about media outlets and how to be more sort of careful with the sort of media that you're consuming about this, because there's obviously a lot of propaganda. So what would you recommend when it comes to filtering what you're listening to about the war?
That's a great question. It sounds a bit cliche, but coming to talks like these is so important. I think that a lot of this presentation, I did adapt it a little bit, but a lot of this presentation was done with my friends from the Sudanese Society, UCL, and we presented the situation in Sudan from first-hand experience in literally like a 2-hour event, and so many people learned so much about the Thawra, the revolution, and the situation in Sudan in general, and they're like, I've never heard this from Wenda, all these things. They just don't understand these issues. Like, they don't have family who are in there, they don't have friends who are in there, they weren't there themselves, they don't know how the streets look, they don't know how people think. So it's always really important when it comes to any conflict, not just the Sudanese conflict, you always need to speak to people from that area, especially people who live there, ask them about their experiences, ask them the sort of nitty-gritty, because I'm pretty sure most of them would love to speak about it. But yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah.
Everyone has the talk. I wanted to ask what role foreign powers currently playing, and do you see any positive foreign intervention possible?
So in terms of the role of foreign powers, I don't know. I've sort of become disillusioned by them over the last 4 years, everything that happened in the revolution, from them negotiating these agreements, which ultimately led to a war. It's sort of like, you guys don't really do anything good for us. I haven't seen anything good for you. Like, we took the risk, we went and did the protest, we gave them the platform for Sudan to emerge as a progressive or a democratic country, and they still sort of fumbled the bag. So in terms of positive foreign intervention, I personally don't trust them, and I think something which is much more effective than that, and their mentality, like I mentioned, is the situation with the passports and them abandoning the embassies. To me, that's crazy. Like the fact that, for example, I'm a British citizen, I got a British passport, and the fact that I could have just had my passport in the embassy that day, and them just leaving it locked in a safe somewhere, is crazy to me. Like, what purpose do they serve? They don't even treat their own civilians well. Like, they're civilians, even though they're just because they're Sudanese, basically. So, yeah, I'd love to say that they have a role, but I think the best role we can play is like ourselves, and it's kind of like, you reminded me actually. So I put this QR code up, so I can do an interview. So this QR code is actually a charity which me and my friends made through various Sunni societies around the UK. Now there's lots of charity initiatives for Sudan. There's one called SAPA, which is the organisation which was started by Dr. Bush al-Rahman. They've raised hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they do incredible work. There's also Muslim Aid, which they do great work as well. But I think why I want to highlight this and why I made the QR code for this one specifically isn't just because we made it. It's because it has the sort of informality of not being an official charity, in the sense that we have the flexibility to sort of give money to causes which need it. We Sudanese people generally are back on the question, like, in all these difficult situations, we've tended to rely on each other more than foreign powers, such as during the internet blackout when we did the Malta Blue movement, such as during the war itself when we're raising our own funds and seeing which initiatives need money and then devoting money towards that. That's precisely what this charity does. We have people on the ground in Sudan who do the work which foreign agencies should be doing but do not do. So yeah, I recommend everyone donate if you can, or at least like take a picture of it so that you can in the future we can share it, whatever.
Yourself and then.
Barakallahu feek, ya khair Tawfeeg. In case the army does beat the RSF, and Burhan as a being is Bisha 2.0, and it ends up going back to being like an army dictatorship, do you see the people going back to protest to bring back civilian rule again? And if civilian rule does come back after the army, how do you think that's going to happen?
Did you say Bishop? Just to double check.
Burhan is going to become like Bishop 2.0.
Yeah, so it's Sudanese, I'm presuming.
Yeah.
Nice one. Okay, so just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. So that's a great question, and something which I've spoken to my friends about. And it's also one of the reasons why I mentioned something specific in my talk. So when I said sometimes people deny the joint role of the RSF and the army in previous situations, such as the June 3rd massacre, such as the coup, etc., etc. One of the things I wanted to draw attention to, especially this time, is the fact that there's no internet blackout. For me, that shows that everything that has happened in the past, the army, or Burhan specifically, has been complicit in. So in an ideal world, we need to know that Burhan is literally fighting this war for his own good. If the RSF had started the war by walking into people's houses, I don't think the army would have stopped them. The reason why the army is fighting back is because the RSF started by, attacking them or their bases or whatever. So it's a matter of their lives are on the line. So I think people need to bear that in mind before being like, oh yeah, Burhan, if the army wins, people shouldn't celebrate Burhan. That's what I mean. But in a practical sense, I feel like it's come to a point where, at the end of the day, we want a stable Sudan where people can live and eat and drink. And I personally wouldn't go to protests again. I actually stopped going to protests for quite a while now, even when they continued to go on before the war, because I sort of became disillusioned by this sort of going nowhere and ultimately ending up back in the hands of someone with guns. So I think, in terms of practical reality, I think a lot of people think similar to me, based on conversations I've had. They become disillusioned and they wouldn't go out for protests and they just want the war to be over. And even if Burhan wants to become the new dictator, that's fine. We can have another revolution in 30 years, whatever. But I think, in terms of what I want, of course I don't want this to be the situation, but I think in terms of practical reality, I'd like to go back home to Sudan. I'd like to live with my family there. And if we have a stable Sudan, no matter who's on here, I'd accept it personally. Not sure about you.
Then the sister, that's the question.
Yeah, you kind of already answered my question, but it was basically, so you mentioned that there was a shift in people's views of Sudan and protests and stuff. And then my question was, well, there was obviously a change because of the revolution and there was hope and whatnot. My question was, because of what was happening in the past couple of years, the war, the coup, do you think that we're going to return to that submissive outlook that we had in protest? Which you kind of answered.
I think that's a good question as well. I think it's a different angle. I think like what's important about this revolution is that it was predominantly led by the youth. So when you say the youth, you have to bear in mind that these same youth are going to be the elders in the future. They're going to have the mindset of not the current elders, but the future elders. So they're going to have the mindset that this government is crap. We went out against this government, we protested, they've been killing us, they've done this, they've done that. So they're never going to be happy with it. But having seen what's happened in the war and having experienced that, I haven't lived through the war in Sudan, so I don't know exactly how people think. But I'd imagine a lot of them would just be like, you know, like it's a broken dream. And at the end of the day, like Sudanese people are Muslim majority, and like I think they also have like a sort of focus on the akhirah. Like there's only so much they'll sort of do in terms of like dunya, like we have to get this, we have to get that. So unless it becomes a matter of survival again, like it did in the past, then I don't think that will be the case.
We have time for one more question.
There's no one else.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I'm really thankful your family is outside the media, but I wanted to ask, why do you think the media outrage compared to the war in Sudan was so different compared to the war in Ukraine?
So compared to what?
You know, the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
why was there so much more focus on that than the war in Sudan? Because it's shocking the silence of
Yeah. That's again a great question. I think that the reason why it's different, I don't like to say racism because it's such a sort of simple term you can sort of throw around everywhere, but it's sort of an internalized sort of racism. Even we have it like as Africans. When I hear about our war in Africa, it doesn't really capture my attention. Like it's almost like, oh, okay, yeah, I know there's a war going on there. But when it's in Ukraine, it's sort of like, whoa, I didn't expect that. That's the whole sort of angle I was trying to take with this talk, to try and get you like to see like we were in a situation where we were like, whoa, we didn't expect that, you know? That's how we see it now. So I think it's never going to be like something which you can sort of undo. It's always something which you have to do at like a grassroots level that we're doing now, where you sort of, like the media's never going to do it for you essentially. They could if they wanted to, but they're never going to practically. So yeah.
I think on that note, we'll conclude. Thank you to yourself, of course, for coming here. Of course, thank you all for attending, and for those on Zoom, we'll just end. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.